Hey friends, this is Marilyn from tarotclarity.com. Again, I want to remind you that I have my settings all the way up for loudness. So if you're having a hard time hearing me, please make yours loud too. I'm speaking as loudly as I can without exhausting myself and getting winded. As it turns out, my doctors tend to think that as a result of having COVID twice in a year and then just 6 months later catching this influenza, it knocked me out for a loop. Apparently it seems as though I've developed late onset asthma that's just come to me later in life. And they've given me medicine to treat asthma and it's been helping. So hopefully that'll keep it in check, and hopefully maybe it's not even asthma, but that's what it seems like it is right now. It's like I caught this. It might have been brewing in my system, just kind of like always been there and never been bad enough that any doctor noticed it or picked it up. And but I kind of have noticed in the course of my life that I've had trouble breathing sometimes. Like I have to crack a window to breathe at night when the house especially is heated, and it gets really hot. I need to crack the window like this much just so I can get air. And it's really hard for me to breathe when I visit my brother in his facility because I always wear a mask because that's where I caught COVID at least once. So I always have to wear like an N95 mask, and they jack it up so hot because mostly old people are there. So I can't breathe, So I've noticed in my past that I've had trouble breathing under certain conditions. And so I guess it's just been brought to the surface. But at any rate, the asthma medicine is preventing me from coughing nonstop. I mean, I've been coughing nonstop before I took this. I still cough, but it's really helped a lot. Anyway, today I thought it would be fun to do a video comparing the Rosenwald, which I know I've been showcasing a lot lately, but I've just been so attached to it for being an everyday person's tarot deck, and also for it being one of the oldest decks besides, what went on in the courts. And then I thought also that I would compare it to the Mitelli deck, which, as everyone knows, is my personal favorite tarot deck. It's probably my personal favorite, although I am really having a great appreciation for the Rosenwald as well. Now, I thought, I'm going to do a side-by-side of the Triumph cards. So why am I doing that, would you say? Well, I confirmed with Marco that the Mitelli also would have been considered an everyday person's tarot deck. It was one of those that was mass-produced. Maybe it cost a little bit more than some of the other ones, just like today when we go to the store and we want to buy a deck of cards. Some cost more than others, right? But by and large, it was available to just anybody. And if you had the correct amount, you could purchase it. So it wasn't like it was just for wealthy people or, at the exclusion of poor people. Now, another reason why I really like these two decks is because absolutely, of course, they're pre-occult. And so they're about as pure a tarot message as could be had. Now, do we know whether or not the tarot deck was invented in one of the Milan courts or the Ferrari courts or a Florentine court? Maybe, there's, I guess evidence that suggests that. Certainly Petrarch, the poet who had the whole Triumph poem, right? The structure of the Triumph, was, I guess, established in his poem. He lived in the Visconti Sforza, I think it was the Visconti castle. So that's possible, but it's also possible that somebody just created the game based on Petrarch's poetry. And I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, and I probably don't know what I'm talking about, so I'll leave it alone. So, but we don't know for sure if the tarot was indeed invented for the rich, by the rich, and then it just trickled down to the common person, or if it existed for the common person and trickled up. And once the noble people discovered that there was this cool game that people were playing, they wanted to have a deck too. So then they commissioned these beautiful decks. As I mentioned, these two decks, the Rosenwald and the Mitelli, excuse me, are decks that were created for the everyday person. Now, one thing that's really important, and we see diversions and we see changes as the game migrated to other countries, where we see changes made. We see changes made, like by the Hermit, changed a little bit. The star card definitely became something else when it migrated to France. It became the constellation of Aquarius, for example. But in its truest form, the original cards represented a concept. They represented a concept. And how the artist decided to portray that concept was up to the artist. And that's why I love these two decks. Let me shut up and flip the camera and show a side-by-side comparison about how both of these artists respectively depicted their understanding of each of the concepts. Now, by coincidence, each one of these decks happens to be in the Rivoltini method, whereby the back was folded over and created a border on the front. So both of these decks are Rivoltini fashioned. Now, it must be made clear that the Rosenwald did not appear to have a full card in its repertoire. That could have been because they just didn't have a full card. Or it could have been that they combined the Fool card with the Magician card, or the Il Gatto card, right? So I can't compare this rightly to this card because the Fool card did not exist. But, the reason I love the Mitelli is because the Mitelli has its own point of view, its own perspective on how the concepts should have been presented. Now, I'm remiss in not stating the dates. The Rosenwald was created no later than 1501, possibly in Perugia, Italy. And I've discussed this many times in other videos because it was found in the book bindings. It was a rejected deck. Perhaps it was printed in reverse, or the numbers were, misaligned or whatever, and it was rejected. And so, see, and so the pages were discarded. But that is the only copy that we have. I think there's another copy that was printed in the proper sequence, and that exists in Germany. Now, Mitelli presented with two cards, and one for the Fool and one for, Il Gatto. And I have flip-flopped personally on which one was which, but I've come to the understanding or the belief that this one probably represented the concept of the Fool, because it seems like he's maybe childish or slow. His clothes, or he's disheveled, he's a mess. He's got toys that would attract a child. He's got a balloon, and that is a balloon, although it's not made of plastic, it's made of animal intestines. And then he's got some type of whirligig, like a wind toy. He's got a feather in his hat, which we see in earlier decks. This is like 1650, I think. So these decks are separated by maybe 140 years, something like that, 150 years, both Italian. So I think this one probably was Mitelli's answer to the Fool card. Just, not the sharpest tool in the shed. And I think that by elimination, that this one is was intended to be like what we call the magician card. Now, true, this one has the dog, but things get confused and muddled up, and it's possible that the dog became associated with the Fool card. Might have been an error. There is there are other decks where I believe that the dog is with the magician. I think we see it in the Tarot of Paris, for example, which was concurrent with this deck. It was created in Paris, but it was created around the same time as the Mitelli. So here we have a version of the Il Bigato from 1501 and from 1650-ish. It's an interesting cuff on his right leg, his right ankle. That's interesting. I've never noticed that before. So he's got, a following of, they're not children. They look like they're adults. So he's kind of like a Pied Piper who kind of cons people. That's why I think that he's the concept of the Il Bigato. And here he's more of a street peddler, right? He's, he comes into town, he tricks, he sets up on a corner. People pay to outsmart him, and he outsmarts them because he's a deceptor. He's a trickster. And then he gets run out of town because people are up to his tricks and it's time to go to the next town. It's also why he was ranked number 1, because he's the lowest. Well, this guy is without number because he's so low in society he doesn't rank. But, this guy is in society the lowest ranking. Maybe the Fool gets some slack, just like in court. He got some slack. He was the only one in court who could speak truth to the sovereign, right? But this guy gets no slack, so when he's found out, it's time to move on. Now, the Mitelli does something different with the cards 2 through 5, which for the time, was interesting. Most decks, particularly the earlier ones, had a reference to Pope Joan. I'm sure it was Pope Joan. I wasn't there. I could be wrong, but in my heart of hearts and in what I've learned and what I've figured out, there could be other references being made. But I think to the audience of 1500, they would have believed that Pope Joan existed, and that I think that the myth of Saint Joan, or Pope Joan rather, was depicted in the female Pope card. But the Mitelli, perhaps in response to pressures, maybe, that were concurrent at this time. We see it in the Bolognese decks that we had the 4 Moors, excuse me, and then later on in the, the Besançon deck, and then some, like the Bacchus and Spanish Captain decks, there were also changes done to the cards 2 through 5, or particularly card 2 and 5, to make them less politically offensive. So here we have and I don't know that I have them in the correct order, but I think I do. So we have here a generic man of the cloth, a generic, secular sovereign, and then another more powerful sovereign, and then a more powerful man of the cloth. That's how I perceive these 4 cards, 2 through 5. But of course, with the Rosenwald, we still have the feminine leader. And I think I've pointed this out in other videos that I've done on the Rosenwald, that, I see her as a sovereign or secular leader in her own right, and not dependent on her femininity. Whereas like the other decks, kind of embellish her femininity, especially modern decks. I could be wrong, but that's just how I perceive it. And I am remiss. Both of these decks, of course, were created by Margot Benedetti. I apologize, Margot. I think it goes without saying sometimes, and I forget. Okay, here we have the secular leader, the emperor, who is in contrast to the feminine because their colors are reversed. And this was a choice made by Margot. Remember, the original sheets were without color. So Margot, as the publisher, made choices. Notice the cobweb embellishments and lack thereof on the emperor, but they're here on the female. And then the Pope. So the Rosenwald was created before there was any, distinction or trouble between the female Pope and the Pope, right? Before there was political issues. It was 1501 at the latest. So these would have been the norm in presenting the concepts of people in political power in Italy, which of course is where the game began. You can't get much more to the truth of the matter than with the Rosenwald being one of the earliest decks for the everyday person. This is what the everyday person, how they would have conceived of the concepts. Remember, these cards were about the concept. So here, now we're back on track with both of them. We have the concept of love, or the lover, right? So we have what we would probably recognize as, a couple, being promised to one another or being sanctioned by Cupid. Now we have maybe he's proposing to the woman. And, this kind of says like the heart wants what the heart wants. And this, again, the concept of love is just merely being portrayed by Cupid, who had become a symbol for love. And he's got his arrow and he's blindfolded because love wants what love wants. My husband and I, we never would have gotten together if we had gotten together through a dating app, for example, because neither one of us would have, I can only speak for myself, but I would not have been drawn to him through a dating app. Because one, he would have been out of the age range that I would have preferred, so I wouldn't have even had him in the category of age, right? So, I think, the blindfold, it makes a lot of sense because you don't really know what you want until you meet it. There's no rhyme or reason for, but once I met my husband, I was like, oh yeah, this guy's the one. But he's not somebody that I would have intellectually chosen initially. But I hope that made sense. Okay, the Chariot. Now here we have what appears to be a prince. He's got a crown. He's accomplished something. He's being paraded. And that's how I perceive it. And, he's got some authority. Maybe he's a duke. But here we have a woman who is perhaps being extolled for her virtues. Now, she's not being pulled around, but we do have doves before her. And it's interesting because in the Anonymous Tarot of Paris, around the same period of time, we have a chariot with, I think, a swan before it. And some of the earlier tarot decks of the concept of the chariot had women, perhaps because they were being created for, to commemorate a wedding or something. And so they were extolling the virtues of the female that was being joined in the union. But we have both examples throughout early Italian history of here, the Rosenwald having like a duke or a prince being acknowledged in a parade, perhaps. Whereas here we have a woman being acknowledged for her virtue. And then we see the same thing in like the early Visconti's forces, a woman in a carriage or a chariot. Now, excuse me, I have put these cards in the order that we're accustomed to seeing. And Marco eliminated the numbers on these cards because, for that reason, I'm sure, so that we could use them in the order that we saw fit. Because they were, after all, discarded, and some of the numbers are kind of wonky. If you look at the numbers that appear on the sheet, I think there's 2 number 8s, for example. So it becomes very, it was clear why it was rejected. But at any rate, if we're assuming that they go with the same number flow as I have here, we have justice, which appears, it hasn't changed a whole lot, perhaps because justice is a concept that other countries understood. So by the time it got to France, for example, they understood this as Lady Liberty or Justice or whatever. And they didn't stray very far from it. But, the other differences that they had, like with 2 through 5, other countries changed it. And Italy did too, because it became politically incorrect. But at any rate, we have justice in a way that we can readily identify her. And we see that she's got a halo, a scalloped halo, which seems to appear on other virtues. Now, I don't think we've seen other virtues here. We have a suggestion in the corners, but I don't know if that was representing, it might have just been a decorative motif more than a virtue. And here we have the early, an early rendition of the hermit, who is, perhaps has a bit of a hunchback. I apologize for the beeping in the background. My husband is installing, I don't know, some kind of detector. And we don't have the hunchback here. We don't see it, but he is elderly. He is infirmed. He's got the crutches. He's old. And here he's got the wings of virtue. So there's virtue in his agedness, perhaps. We see him perhaps as Father Time. He could be seen in that way. Going out, he's number 9 traditionally. So he's going out. It's like the ending of something. Now, depending on the direction he faces, it becomes part of the read, right? I apologize for the glitching of my phone. I don't understand it. It's probably time to get a new phone. Here we have the Wheel of Fortune. Now, I understand that the Wheel of Fortune in the Rosenwald, was missing quite a bit of, detail. And so whoever recreates this deck, and Marco is, a case in point, they had to determine what they thought would have been in there. But the concept clearly is the same. And here with Mitelli, one of the reasons why I love Mitelli so much is because he took, he honored the concept. The concept of each card was just the concept, right? It was just the Wheel of Fortune, or it was, justice, or it was, strength or fortitude. But he presented it in his own way, just like other artists did too. But he gave it a fresh look, right? Here we have a more traditional Wheel of Fortune. And we would see the same concept in the Visconti Sforza cards, where someone is reigning, someone has reigned, someone is about to reign, and someone has no reign. But here we just have Lady Fortuna, I presume, and she's showering the fortunate with a turn of good luck. Or it could represent in a reading, be careful not to waste money. It depends, I think. But I think generally this card on its own is probably a nod to a change of fortune for the better. Now, there are other presentations of fortitude. I mean, one of the Visconti Sforza decks has fortitude as, I guess, Hercules clubbing the lion in the head as brute force. So it's the concept, remember, that's behind these cards. But others have chosen probably a biblical reference. Maybe she's Delilah, with the column. And here the column has been damaged. But the concept is fortitude. Column is the most strong part of a building. It holds everything up. The ceiling may collapse, but the column will stand, will remain standing, at least to a large degree. Represented here in both cases as a woman, and as I mentioned, it may be a biblical reference. Excuse me. Now here, with the card traditionally known as the Hanged Man. In 1501, the suggestion of sacks of money, which may have been a reference to Judas Iscariot, bringing the concept of betrayal, Now, the Italians would have recognized this particular type of hanging upside down by a foot, and your leg would automatically fall that way, as the consequence of of betrayal, or I think Gertrude Moakley was the first person who pointed out that these were sort of like wanted posters. The reason that they were alive when they were printed, the person was alive, is because the whole point of this was to humiliate the person who did something socially deplorable. And so they had to be recognized. That was part of it, was their disgrace and their humiliation. And because they were Northern Italian, the chances were good they were blondes. My paternal grandmother was from Northern Italy, and she was a blonde with blue eyes. So I know that there's Italians with blonde hair and blue eyes. I didn't inherit any of those characteristics, but it seems as though some of my grandchildren did. But it also helped that they married Nordic people too. But that gene had to be there. The gene had to be there on my side for it in order for it to get passed down. At any rate. So this would have been readily recognized, and the sacks of gold enhanced the concept that it was some type of betrayal. And they used the opportunity to maybe reference Judas, who betrayed Christ. But without the sacks of gold, it would have been identifiable as a betrayal. But here with the Mitelli, we have quite a different card to represent the concept. Now this looks like somebody who's, I don't want to use the M word, but who's about to M this individual who looks like he's sleeping. But perhaps for this period of time, this was also another type of execution for the same act. And Mitelli chose to represent the act of punishment for consequences in a different way. I'm not really sure of the story behind this. It may be a reference to something biblical that I'm just not aware of. but it's understood that it represented the same concept as this card, and this card is known to represent consequence for behavior. We all know this. Now, when he appears, he frequently appears with a scythe, and both of these guys have it. This is, of course, one of the first decks here. So it would predate anything in Marseille, because Marseille, as far as we know, the earliest copy that we have is from 1639. Now, that's not to say there weren't earlier cards than that created in France, but we don't have any evidence of it, and we do have evidence of early Italian decks, and this wasn't like because it was a fancy deck by a rich family. This was just like a deck published for everyday folks. So, but the reason I point that out is because we have the death card trampling over anybody. He's not, there's no discrimination. We all get it at the end, right? Here, Mitelli shows very interesting choices for the death card. We have the hourglass, which represents time passing. And then we have the pyramid in the background, which also reminds us of how eternally long removal from this realm is. I mean, we don't know what is next, but the period of time we're here is brief, and the period of time we're not here is long, unless we're reincarnated or whatever. I love this portrayal. Here we have temperance as a virtue. Excuse me. Believe me, I'd be coughing nonstop. It would be impossible for me to do a video if I wasn't taking this asthma medicine. I just wouldn't be able to. But I always see the temperance card as detoxifying, right? Eliminating or diluting the toxicity of something with perhaps water. I love the Mitelli devil. That's some fire and brimstone stuff right there. Now, I agree. This one is kind of like a comical devil. Kind of reminds me of the Grand Poobah in the Flintstones cartoons. But they both have a pitchfork. And Marco chose to have him in red, maybe suggesting red flames. I apologize for the dishes in the background, but when your husband decides to do the dishes, you don't argue with them. Isn't this a beautiful card? Now, I see the devil card as vanity and vices. Sometimes it could be fun, sometimes, it could be a suggestion to have a little fun or let your hair down. But in other times, it could be a suggestion of wickedness. And I always find it interesting when the devil card, which I frequently will identify in my own mind as vanity coming before the fall. Because it's when we're at our most vain that we're struck down. We're made humbled. Now remember, the concept of whatever this card represented was what was important. And how the artist would have portrayed it was their own business. Now, was the concept lightning striking? Or was the concept something else? Certainly, in the Della Torre deck, we see a tower without lightning, and the representation there, which was around the same period of time as this Mitelli deck, around 1660, the Della Torre, is just a, oh no, the Della Torre does have a deck, does have a tower struck by lightning. Maybe, oh no, I'm speaking out of turn. Maybe it's the Sicilian deck, which is just a tower. But at any rate, is it the concept of lightning? Because this card is independent of a tower. It just shows something coming from the heavens. And if you've seen my channel and enough videos on my channel, you know when I see this card, I've been saying it since the day I got this deck, is may God strike me dead if I'm lying, and then he gets struck. So, and then I'm wondering, like, is this a historic reference to somebody who was struck by lightning and died? I know there was, I think there was an emperor who may have been struck by lightning, a Roman emperor. He doesn't look like a Roman emperor. But I just love that the concept seems to be identified in this card as the lightning. And then when we see it in the Via Veal, I think, we see, you know, the shepherd with a flock and a tree being like struck by lightning. Now, I don't know if it's so much about the shepherd and his flock or the tree getting struck. And then here, you know, if Italian cities were very proud of their cities, and one of the, you know, things that they did was build towers, right? I think towers were a point of pride. So maybe to illustrate lightning striking, the story was, or the concept was to show a tower being struck, because those were the things that were struck more readily than not. So it may never have really been the tower. It may have always been the lightning or something from above. And the reason I love the Mitelli so much is because it reminds us of that in the Italian decks. Now, we're getting to the heavenly cards. And some people might argue that the tower card, or the lightning card, is the first card in the sequence of the heavens, or the celestial cards. Could be, especially if it is about lightning coming from the heavens. Here we have the star. The concept is the star. That's it. Now, the French decided to take it in another direction, and maybe the star card became, they made a reference to the Aquarian constellation for the star card. Because let's think of what the star card might have represented, right? It might have represented hope. It might have represented opportunity. A person could see the star card and readily understand that just by seeing the star card. But maybe it wasn't so easy to understand that. And so other cultures, perhaps, the French, for example, may have created this, you know, the constellation of Aquarius to represent hope, because when the rains came, they came during the constellation of Aquarius, and then that's when hope happened, and that's when opportunity became. Now, this is how you know, I'm just saying that that's a possibility. That's like my own rabbit hole led me there. I don't know what the French were thinking, you know. However, look at this Mitelli star card. I'm convinced that at some point when this migrated to France, they didn't see this as the star card, which is maybe why they needed to invent their own star card. I think they saw this and confused it with the hermit, because he has a light, he has a lantern, and he's traveling in the night. But the point of the card is the star. But when it migrated, I'm convinced that something got lost in translation, and that this card was misunderstood for the hermit. And then the hermit went from being a crutched old man. He's in here somewhere, right? He went from being a crutched old man, representing the passage of time, to Diogenes, who roams the world looking for an honest man. So something got lost in translation. But at any rate, the concept, for this card is the star. That's it. Now, we could say, well, how does this represent hope? If we're to understand that the star card meant hope. Well, maybe this is a reference to something that we no longer remember. And his sack is filled with stuff. So I'd love to know the story of this. All right, here we have the moon. The concept is the moon and what the moon represents. You would have understood what the moon represented just by looking at the moon, and we can too. But Mitelli chose to represent the moon. The moon is not as significant here as it is here, right? As the star card is not as significant here as it was in the Rosenwald. We have the concept of the moon enhanced by the presence of Diana and her hound. Here, the concept is the sun, a nice big bold sun. We all understand what that means when we see the sun. But Mitelli chose to represent the sun in a more allegorical way with Apollo, the sun god. But the concept is still the sun. Now, you'll notice that I put these cards in this order because this is the order I prefer. Now here, the Rosenwald portrays the world card as what can be accomplished in this world. Attainment, accomplishment, right? And we have a city on a hill, towers. This is probably success. And, having beautiful towers in your city was probably a thing, that they were proud of. And here, the world is conceived in a different way, because with great accomplishment comes great burden. He has the whole world in his hands, as the song says. He's got the whole world in his hands. But with that whole world, there comes great responsibility and burden. You can achieve the whole world and lose your soul, which I think is why this card is the proper last card. Because after you achieve what you achieve in this world, you're called upon to be held accountable for your actions. And that's why I love it's one of the reasons why I love the Italian decks, because I feel like they got that right. That just, not all regions had this as the last card. Not all Italian regions did, but some of the Italian regions did. And the ones that did, I really like that understanding of the order of the cards. So here the concept is Gabriel blowing his horn, the angel. Now here it's clearly depicted as judgment, and here the concept is not as spelled out. It could be seen, if you just read it by virtue of what appears on the card, as just an announcement, but it does seem to be a divine announcement. Maybe in that period of time, when people saw this, they would understand that it meant it's time, it's the end days, and it's time to be held accountable. And we'll know it by virtue of the angel blowing his horn. Well, I hope that you've stayed here for this comparison between the Rosenwald and the Mitelli, because I think they're both really beautiful decks. And meaningful decks for the common person. And I guess here in the States, I'm relating to the common person with what's going on here. And, you know, the common person has to stand up to what is going on and has to wake up, you know. So I'll probably be using the Rosenwald and the Mitelli quite a bit because those two decks have really, I've grown a fondness for both of those decks. And I hope to instill a fondness for each of these decks to you guys as well. And thank you very much, sorry, for staying here for this video this long. In my posts, I'll try to keep abreast of things that are happening here because I know they're not being publicized as they should be. Until next time, friends, peace, stay well, and be kind.